Hello and welcome to this Parallel Project Training podcast. This podcast is linked to the APM PMQ syllabus for exams starting in September 2024. My name's Ruth Phillips and I'm here today with one of Parallel senior trainers, Lisa Regan, and we're going to be talking to you about governance. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa.
Hi Ruth, glad to be here today to talk about governance.
This is quite a wide-ranging topic. The learning objective in the APM PMQ syllabus for governance arrangements says that we've got to understand governance structures as a framework of authority and accountability for the delivery of a project which align with organisational practice. We're going to be talking about these two aspects of governance, what's going on at an organisational level and how that may affect the project and how they align within each other.
Okay.
So let's turn our attention to the first learning outcome. And this asks us to know about different types of permanent and temporary organisation structures and their features. And they want us to understand that an organisation's governance approach will inform the approach used for a project. So let's talk about that. What are the different types of organisation structure that exist?
Okay, so from the APM's perspective, it's the usual option A, option B and something in between. So functional, I would say, is option A. The project is option B and matrix is a halfway house. You might hear the terms used permanent and temporary. Functional is the permanent setup. It's quite stable. You might not even see the job title project manager in a functional setup because the functional manager is the person that's doing the project management. So the head of marketing or the head of finance, they are the people that are driving the projects in the functional setup.
Their functional work drives what they're doing, and the fact that they're managing projects as part and parcel of that is the side role.
Absolutely.
So that's the functional organisation.
Yep.
What's another
Yep.
type?
So the flip side of that for me is the project organisation.
Okay.
We'll come back to that good old definition of what's a project, a unique transient endeavour. Project organisation is also transient. It only exists for the duration of the project. Yeah.
Right.
So people are brought together just to work on a project, and when the project finishes, that organisation disappears. It's not a permanent setup at all, but you would definitely have a project manager in this setup.
What type of organisation has a project organisation at its heart?
In my experience, when I've worked in a university, they had a whole arm of their organisation that was just project setup.
Right.
And it was just to work on, for example, academic collaboration projects, and they were just set up for that. So it lends itself to consultancy work, if that makes sense. Whereas the functional setup, my background is in manufacturing, so I recognise the functional setup with people in, for example, HR reporting to a director of HR. It's a really straightforward setup.
It's interesting comparing and contrasting the two, because I get this impression that the functional organisation, that people are aligned along their functions, their specialities. It's very stable, more hierarchical maybe.
Yeah.
Whereas the project organisation, a lot more flexible. Once that particular project is completed, the structure changes again to coalesce around another set of projects. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. The positives and negatives about both of them, really. The functional one, if you're a member of staff working in a functional organisation, you've got a really clear career path. Yeah. For example, if you start off as a team leader, you might then move to a supervisor, you might then move to a head of, or whatever the structure is. In the project setup, that's not as clear. You do make progress, but it's like a snake rather than a straight line. You jump from projects to projects. You will make progression, but it's not as clear cut.
That might appeal to some people that like variety and challenge. It's got definite pros and cons to it.
Yeah.
So those are either ends of the spectrum. What's the one in the middle?
So the one in the middle is the matrix. We try with the matrix to get the best of both worlds. So you've got a temporary team and a permanent team. You've got people doing BAU work and people doing project work in the matrix setup. So you've got a mix of skills. Sometimes people struggle. They say, am I in a matrix or am I in a project setup? It all comes down to what happens at the end of the project. Right. So if at the end of the project you go back into the organisation or you go straight onto another project within the organisation, you're in a matrix. If at the end of the project, that's the end for you, the contract's finished and not working for that organisation anymore, you're in a project organisation. So You've got a halfway house in a matrix because you're reporting to two people, a project manager and a functional manager, and that can cause confusion. In my previous career, I had someone saying, oh, can you do this? It's urgent. And the other manager said, can you do this? It's urgent. How did I know which one of those took priority?
If those two managers aren't communicating well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Between each other.
Absolutely. I'm not going to be so down on matrix. You can have quite a varied workload with matrix. You can be doing some project work. You can be working on BAU.
And I guess that it also gives you some opportunity to do things outside of your function. I can see that on a personal development standpoint, it can be quite helpful.
Yeah. Hopefully that's shown you functional, option A, project, option B, matrix, trying to get the best of both worlds.
So how would those structures then and the governance approach that an organisation take, how will that inform the approach that we need to take for our project governance?
So with the functional approach, governance is about things being set in stone.
Yeah.
So it's strict goals. You've got to be in control of what's going on. Governance is managed within the functions. If you're in an organisation that's got a strong project focus, governance has a different focus because your whole organisation has a different focus. So
yes,
governance will be all project based. So it'll be things like what methodology you're using and making sure that your project is in alignment with your strategy is really important for governance in the project setup.
Absolutely.
Whereas the halfway house, the matrix, it's a blend. From a governance point of view, you'd have to be able to handle dual reporting. You know, I talked about having a functional manager and a project manager.
Yeah.
Governance would have to be well defined to make sure that, you know, when and where to escalate, for example. What are the escalation routes? That is a real cause of conflict in the matrix situation.
Depending on your organisation's governance, it's about the balance of power between the function and the project as to what drives the priorities of the governance approach.
Yep, absolutely.
So we've talked now about organisation structures. Let's turn our focus to our project and the roles and responsibilities within project management. Can you talk me through a typical project management structure in terms of project roles and responsibilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with the steering group. They are usually people that are peers of the sponsor. They should be at that level of the organisation that they've got the influence. They can nominate the sponsor. They support and advise the sponsor. They authorise the business case. They're owning those higher level risks, and it's their job to influence and manage the stakeholders. Yeah. If an issue gets raised and the sponsor can't sort it, the steering group have got to step in to use their advice and guidance to support the sponsor.
So we're looking here, senior managers within the organisation, people that have got the authority and credibility to make those decisions to support the sponsor of the project.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, sometimes I have projects that have got project boards. Is that the same group of people as a steering group, or is that something different?
I would say that's the same thing. A terminology, it's just a different name for the same group of people. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I can think of one project where I actually had both a steering group and a project board. And the distinction for me was that the steering group did just that. They steered, but they didn't necessarily make the decisions, whereas the project board had that authority to make decisions, but pretty much they're interchangeable.
I guess it depends on the size and the complexity of the project, doesn't it?
Exactly. So you mentioned the sponsor then.
Yep.
Who's the sponsor? What are they responsible for?
So the sponsor has got to be somebody that's on a higher level of the organisation than the project manager. There's no point having a sponsor that's on that same level of the organisation as the project manager. They've got to be able to take escalation from the project manager. With that in mind, the main driver for the sponsor, the key phrase, it's business case. Because they own the business case. Not only that, they own the realisation of benefits. So they're there day one, but they're also there in that extended project life cycle of sponsor.
Right. That's a really important role then, isn't it? Because all too often the driving force of the project comes to an end once we've delivered the outputs, but we're only halfway there then. We haven't delivered the benefits. And so that sponsor having that oversight right to the end of benefit realisation is really crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. They are the golden thread. We talked about the steering group supporting the sponsor. The sponsor should support the project manager. They should help the project manager deal with anything that's escalated, any kind of issues, any kind of changes that are escalated. If the project manager asks for a contingency to be drawn down, hopefully the sponsor will be in agreement and that's needed and they can authorise that.
Yeah.
They should be supporting the project manager in all aspects. So if there's any kind of stakeholder conflict going on, the sponsor can hopefully pull some strategic strings to get that sorted.
That's really important, understanding the need for that separation. For me, the sponsor's a really key governance role, because it's making sure that the project manager's not marking their own homework, to coin a phrase, that you've got somebody else that's involved, but that can provide that scrutiny, that sounding board. They can make a decision. That direction is slightly separate from the day-to-day management.
What always sticks in my mind, Ruth, is I learned many years ago that there's only two people needed on a project manager and a sponsor. Everything else can be done by the project manager. So you absolutely need a sponsor to be able to escalate, like you said.
And in terms of terminology, sometimes they can be called project executive, project champion, lots of different terminology for this person, but they're very much that figurehead of the project, having that vision, as you said, ownership of that business case. They really know why this project has to go ahead and why it's needed and what it's going to deliver.
Yeah.
Let's now turn our attention to the other very important role, and that's our project manager. Tell me about the responsibilities of a project manager.
The project manager manages the project. It sounds a bit too obvious, doesn't it? But that's what they're doing. I talked about the sponsor owning the business case. The project manager owns the PMP, the project management plan. It's that detailed document that's got all the details of how you're going to run the project.
Yeah.
And the project manager is managing the team. They're also managing stakeholders. They are dealing with suppliers. They're dealing with end users. And they're reporting, so escalating anything or making a report of progress up to the sponsor. Fundamentally, they're delivering that project to make sure that the benefits are realised.
Yes, I really like that image of the PMP being the contract, because the business case, the sponsor sets out, this is what we're trying to achieve here, and these are the reasons why. And then the project manager says, right, okay, and this is how I'm going to do it for you. And they shake hands, and off we go. What differences are there between the role of the project manager and the project sponsor?
So you mentioned what happens in the concept phase in regards to the business case. When we get into definition, the project manager is the one, as we've said, owns the PMP. The sponsor would approve that PMP. So that's the difference for me in definition. When we move into deployment, the project manager is front and centre. They're running the project. But the project manager would, for example, escalate changes to the sponsor, and the sponsor would consider the change and approve them. So in deployment, it's the biggest kind of delineation. The PM is about delivery. The sponsor is about support. Moving into transition, the project manager is managing the practical things like final drawings, lessons learned, final accounts, making sure that all contracts have been signed and sealed. Whereas the sponsor would be signing off the outputs. The sponsor will be getting ready for benefits realisation in transition, whereas the project manager really won't, because that's the end for them. You can see that there is some distinct differences, isn't there, between what the project manager does across the life cycle.
Thinking about relationships with other people on the project, due to where the sponsor sits, they've probably got more of a relationship with senior management, senior stakeholders, but also very close relationship with the project manager. The project manager, again, needs to have a good relationship with the sponsor, the steering group, but probably more close relationship about motivating and leading their team as well.
The only other thing I could think of, Ruth, was that they have a different role at the reviews, don't they, project manager and sponsor? The project manager is more about, at the reviews, collecting all the information, whereas the sponsor will review that information, and then between the two of them, they'll make the decision whether it's go or no go for the project.
That nicely leads us back into the subject of governance, because you need to have that separation of those responsibilities, that one person collates, presents the information, and the other person scrutinises it and makes a decision based on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned then project team members who will be involved in doing the delivery of the work. Are there any other roles that support the project manager?
So we've got project users. They're involved at the beginning and the end, because they tell you what's required. And at the other end of the project, they'll be the people that will accept the product. They'll be the ones that tell you whether you've met those requirements or not, because they own that finished product. They'll be the people that be using it. As the project's progressing, they should be liaising with the project manager. They should be telling you, this isn't right, can we make a change request, or this isn't working. People get the impression sometimes that the users run the project. It's not the case. The sponsor is the one that has the final say. So they can ask for a change, but once it's been assessed and whether it's going to be accepted, rejected or deferred, the sponsor will have the final say.
Sometimes there's this notion that end users are just this one single homogenous group that think with one mind and have all got the same opinions, which of course in reality we know is not the case. Each individual user, each group of users can have different priorities, different requirements, etc. Sometimes those requirements come into conflict with one another. That's why the sponsor is such an important role. What about some other roles then?
How about product owner? This is a bit of a niche one. Sometimes people struggle if they don't work in the iterative or the agile way of working because product owners are part of the woodwork of the iterative or agile way of working. So product owners are the people that oil the wheels, I think. They work for your organisation, but they've got an eye on the outside world, if that makes sense, because they're interfacing between the customers or the users. They're interpreting the needs. Product owners have got to be technical people. They've got to be able to understand what the users are asking them for, but they've got to translate that into a scheme of work or a deployment list for the development team within the agile way of working.
That's a really good description of what they do. They've got a role within the project, but they've also got this longer term, more business as usual view of the product that they own. They've got to keep an eye on the outside world, what's going on there, what technological advances might be coming along that we can take advantage of. They've got that longer term and that project focus. It's quite an interesting role.
Yeah, I agree.
What about a project management office?
So PMO, project management office, fundamentally is admin support. That's the base level of the PMO. What you've got PMO for is hopefully to save you some time so they can help you, for example, write the minutes of a meeting or book meeting rooms and things like that. But the PMO in more recent times is more developed than that. They've moved into a more technical support, so you can get experts in your PMO in estimation or risk management. They can also be the gatekeepers of the most up-to-date versions of documents.
Maybe your configuration management, your configuration librarian.
Yeah, absolutely. So PMO is admin support, but in a more developed organisation, they can be more technical support. The really developed stage of PMO work is because they're independent, they can come along and do an audit and support you in that way.
Yeah. So key roles then within the project management team. Okay, so let's have a look now at our third learning outcome. This is asking us to understand why aspects of project management governance are required, policies, regulations, functions, etc. And then asking us to look at the impact of the choice of life cycle on the governance framework and limits of financial authority. Let's first of all talk about the aspects of project governance that are required.
So it's good to start with policies. They're giving you those operational guidelines. For example, an expenses policy, it's for the whole organisation. It's not just project related. You've got to comply to it wherever you are in the organisation. So high level, starting to move down a bit closer to the project itself. Specific regulations. So any kind of guidelines and structures. If you're working in the construction industry, there'll be 1,001 regulations that you've got to stick to. The point of regulations is to give confidence to your stakeholders working to regulations. Getting closer to the actual delivery, processes, procedures and functions. These are the foundations of project management. It's all the contents of the PMP. It's definitely giving instruction. For example, which life cycle are you going to use? How are you going to assess your risks? How are you going to manage your costs on your project? So you're getting closer to the coalface, aren't you, with processes, procedures and functions. But all aspects of governance out there, you're just getting more granular work through these. And I think the final one, delegated responsibilities, is absolutely nitty-gritty. Who's doing what? Setting the expectations, and you'd use your RAM or your RACI matrix to show your delegated responsibilities. Hopefully that's given a good overview of starting high level from the organisational governance, but governance runs all the way through down to the day-to-day of what you're delivering on.
So my background has been working as a supplier side project manager within a customer organisation, and it's quite often the case that my organisation has got different policies, processes and procedures to the customer organisation. And so what we've had to do on the project when we've set up our project management governance is make sure that all of those policies and processes are respected. And that can be a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, it must cause conflict sometimes, mustn't it?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Let's think now about our choice of life cycle. So we've got 3 different life cycles: the linear life cycle, the iterative life cycle, and a hybrid life cycle, which we have a whole other podcast about. Let's have a look now at those different life cycle choices and what choice might affect how the governance framework is set up, and also financial authority on the project as well?
So starting with linear, so it's usually the place to start, isn't it?
Yeah.
So with linear, if we're talking about governance, it's embedded in every phase of the life cycle. And you've got those reviews, those go or no go. Yes, it's very structured. You're saying yes or no. I'm giving you authority to move on or not.
Yeah.
And within your phase, assurance should be happening. Yeah. And project managers will be making reports and team members will be making reports to project managers to use that information at the decision gates. Yeah. In terms of financial authority in the linear life cycle, in your PMP, you'll have what are the limits of financial authority. You know, you're allowed to purchase up to, for example, £500 or £5,000, whatever it is. And in terms of funding, with the linear life cycle, sometimes it's released at the beginning of the project, but depending on the level and the complexity of a project, your funding would usually be released after you've gone through a gate review, wouldn't it? So that's how it relates back to governance.
So linear life cycle, very much structured, strong governance really embedded into that whole life cycle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about the iterative life cycle?
With iterative, it's different because it's different. I would say that governance is more devolved, if that makes sense, into the project team. Mm-hmm. It is embedded, but typically it's more flexible just because of the nature of the iterative way of working. You'll have governance going on within that time box, but you've got to be open to change. That will feed back into the level of control that you have.
Sometimes there's this feeling that iterative life cycles are the Wild West and anything goes. Yeah. And if it's done properly, it's really not.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting one. And talking about financial authority in iterative projects, there's a shift of mindset because cost for an iterative project, cost for a time box is fixed.
Yeah,
there's not so much debate about that as there might be in a linear project. But maybe where the governance focus within an iterative project is more about requirements, scope, that aspect of it, because real decisions need to be made there. Are we prioritising the right requirements? Are they going to give us the most benefits? The cost is really a bit incidental because we've agreed what it's going to be and that's it. It's fixed. Crack on.
Yeah, the resources are there. You've just got to use them to the best
ability. Yeah. What about the hybrid then?
So you've got the governance in each phase because the hybrid's got that backbone of the linear life cycle. But I would say at delivery, your governance can be a bit more flexible with the hybrid life cycle. For example, if you're delivering something in stages or in tranches, in your deployment phase, obviously the governance would be more embedded just for that tranche. And in terms of the finances for hybrid, it's similar to the linear life cycle. Your funding would normally be released at the stage gates because you've still got the backbone in there.
One of the major reasons why organisations choose a hybrid life cycle is because they really want that more traditional governance structure. But they want to take advantage of delivering projects in a slightly more agile way.
Yeah, they've not gone to the Wild West route, like you say. Yeah.
So last learning objective then is understand the importance of linking projects to an organisation's objectives. So let's have a chat about how we do this, because I see the organisation as this big nebulous thing, and we've got these engines of change known as projects. How do we tie them up? How do we make sure that what we're doing in the project world is actually meeting our organisational aims and objectives?
Yeah, we've got to kind of expand it out now. So we started talking about projects. We've got to go into the wider world of programmes and portfolios here.
So we've got a bit of terminology there. Let's define these three different structures, Lisa. How does the APM define the project?
So it's the unique transient endeavour, and it's put in place to deliver specific outcomes and deliver some specific benefits. When I think about projects, it's the cold face, it's the delivery. Yeah.
So then you mentioned programs. What's a program?
Programs for me are fundamentally collections. It's multiple projects put together. You can have some BAU as well in your program, but you don't have to. It's either a collection of projects or projects aligned with some BAU as well. You're stepping away from the delivery. You're talking more about coordination in programs.
I see programs as a bigger structure to really harness the transformational change from a number of projects that are linked together and collected together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then finally, you mentioned portfolio. What's a portfolio and how's that different?
So portfolio is stepping even further away from delivery, even further away from the coalface. Portfolios are collections of projects and programs. When I think about portfolios, I always think about you start to care. You start to think about, have we got the resources? Have we got the people? Have we got the finances to deliver these projects? And fundamentally, Are they the right projects for our organisation? Are they contributing to our current strategy? I know it sounds a bit twee this week, but I think about Churchill pushing tanks across Europe was a portfolio manager. You know, there's always that picture of him with his little slidey thing on the end of his stick. And he's pushing resources to different places. That's what you're doing with portfolio management. You're not on the front line. You're not involved in the actual delivery, but you're coordinating the pluses and minuses. Can we afford it? Have we got the resources? Does it contribute? Should we be doing this at all?
Actually, that image of Churchill with his pushy thing is really apt, because as the wider organisational strategy changes, so you then push different projects and programmes in different directions as well. It's not a static kind of thing. I once heard that portfolios and portfolio management is about choosing the right projects and programmes to do. And then projects and programme management is doing a project or a programme in the right way. And I think that's quite a nice distinction. Well, I think we've had a really good look at governance. There's a lot to unpack within this learning objective there. We've looked at organisational structures, project roles and responsibilities, how governance of the organisation can affect project management governance, and how the life cycle of a project impacts on its governance framework. And then we've also just had a quick look at some of the other change structures that might be in use in our organisation that really pin projects back to an organisation's objectives. Thanks very much, Lisa. That's been great.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Bye-bye.